Group Pet+Wearing Books+Family Mind Reading Technique+Aerial+Sweet Pet+Brainless, Wen Baobao was accidentally reborn after being killed by Mo Xiu.Wen Baobao, who learned about the fate of the whole family in advance, reversed the fate of the original character who lived a short life at the age of 3, exposed the methods used by the scoundrel uncle to frame the whole family, and kept away from his eccentric grandmother. A few years later, Big Brother Wen made a fortune and became the top scholar in literature, second brother Wen Jinbao became the martial arts champion, Ge Wen made progress and became the richest person in the country. For a moment, Wen Baobao, who had just started reading, was loved by countless people. Mother. Good girl, you are really my little sweetheart. Wen Baobao. Mother, I want to eat candy. Mother. No way. Men from the Wen family. Chapter 1. Wen Baobao wears books. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Wen Baobao was killed by Mo Xiu. The other party took advantage of her unpreparedness and stabbed her heart with a sword. In order to protect innocent people, this heroic death in the battle between immortals and demons was recorded in the history of the immortal world, and it can be considered a worthwhile death. When she regained consciousness again, she seemed to hear the voices of women talking in the faint cries of men around her. And my whole body was squeezed so hard that I couldn't move, especially my head, which was repeatedly squeezed. Madam, use your strength again. It's about to be born, and at this moment, you must not let go of your strength. The woman on the bed was already sweating profusely in pain, unable to respond to the midwife's words, and could only scream in pain. The shouting made the head of the family and 3 young masters of different ages outside the door turn pale. The youngest when progressive was frightened and shouted, "Mom," repeatedly. Wen Shoufu anxiously guarded the door, pacing back and forth. At this moment, his aura as the richest man in the city is completely absent. Just as he was about to rush in, a deafening cry came out. The lady's maid, who was close to her, pushed open the door to welcome the spring and quickly reported the good news. Congratulations to the master, congratulations to the master. I have a young lady in my life. Upon hearing these words, Wen Shoufu and his 3 sons burst into the room with joy on their faces. Most likely, it was due to giving birth for too long. The lady lying in bed had a pale face and was still holding a pink baby doll in her arms. Wen Shoufu saw Lin's face full of fatigue due to childbirth, and his eyes were filled with heartache. In front of everyone, he directly kissed her. Madam, you've worked hard. Lin's face turned red as she pressed her fingers against the large face that was approaching her. Wen Shoufu, you old and unscrupulous, the children are still here. The 3 young masters did not feel uncomfortable when they saw the closeness of their parents. Wen Jinjin even put off his small leather boots, climbed onto the bed with his hands and feet, and gave a heavy kiss on Lin's face, saying, "Mom, I'm so worried about you outside." Lin rubbed the head of her youngest son and looked at the other 2 sons. They looked at themselves with equally distressed eyes. Lin suddenly felt that the heavens were really kind to her. Wen Baobao, who had been in Lin's arms all along, closed his eyes and listened to everyone's conversation, suddenly felt the scene in front of him very familiar. Wen Shoufu. 3 sons. Isn't this the name of the characters in her notebook that she read in her spare time the night before she died in battle? In the storybook, as the richest man in a city in Jiangnan, the Wen family's eldest wife gave birth to 3 sons and a daughter. Due to the fact that the 2 middle-aged couples only had such a daughter, they were spoiled and irritable by the whole family. In the end, they were deceived by the legitimate daughter of the second family, who had always been jealous of the big house, and collided with the crown prince who was on a tour in humble clothes, causing the whole family to be exiled. Believing that his family was happy and filial to his mother, he was always deceived by his biased mother and helped the uneducated second wife, occupying all the property of the eldest family. After the accident, not only did he not lend a helping hand, but he also conspired with outsiders to frame the big house, resulting in the tragic death of his third son Wen Jinbao in prison, and the Lin family was also sold to a brothel. A good home, due to the jealousy and design of the second room, was left with a miserable ending. And the newly born Wen Baobao is the daughter born to the eldest son in the storybook. Wen Baobao listened to the warm words around her and secretly swore that she would not let her home in this life reproduce the tragedy in the storybook. "Mother, is this my younger sister?" Wen Jinbao asked curiously as he looked at the newborn child in Lin's arms. Lin smiled gently and said, "Yes, from now on, you three will be people with younger sisters. You must take good care of her." "Great, I finally have a younger sister." Wen Jinbao suppressed his excited voice and whispered, afraid of waking up his closed eyes. Li Xiaotong, who lives next door to the magistrate, always shows off how cute his sister is in the school. Now he also has a younger sister. His sister is pink and definitely cuter than Li Xiaotong's sister. I must take my younger sister out another day and also show off at the school. Wen Baobao opened his eyelids slightly and saw a young child's hand reaching out, suddenly being slapped open. His body was suddenly lifted up by a force. "Let Dad take a look, our little baby." "Dad, it took me several days to give you a good name, just call it Wen Baobao. How about that? From now on, you will be a good baby for our whole family." After speaking, a big face covered in short green whiskers was about to be pressed against it. Upon hearing about her biological father in this life, Wen Baobao gave herself the same name as in her previous life and was very satisfied. "But it doesn't mean that I am willing to get close to this big bearded face." "Wait. Don't. She's still a baby now, rubbing her big face against it must hurt a lot. Mother, help me." The excited little milk voice stunned Wen Xiufu's movements. Did he hallucinate? Wen Xiufu looked around the room and saw his wife and 3 sons. With a shocked expression on his face, he said incredulously, "Did you hear me too?" Lin also felt incredulous. "It seems like the voice was made by our daughter." In order to verify the big guy's conjecture, Wen Xiufu deliberately leaned his face forward again. "Stinky Dad, bad." The little baby in his arms waved his hands in protest. Now everyone in the big house is certain that they can indeed hear the voice of their little treasure. However, this matter is too strange. Wen Xiufu and the Lin family discussed that outsiders should never know. Cover the baby's ears in your arms and remind your 3 sons repeatedly. Wen Jinkai, Wen Jinbao, and Wen Jinbao nodded cautiously. Suddenly, an old woman's voice rang out in the yard. "Young master, the old lady wants you to come over." This voice was from Mrs. Lin, who was serving Mrs. Wen. Upon hearing this, Wen Baobao became nervous. She followed Mrs. Wen and came up with many bad ideas that harmed the big family. "Dad, don't go. They are holding back a lot of bad water and waiting to harm you." Upon hearing the voice of his own daughter, Wen Xiufu's face changed. How could one's own mother harm oneself? Pretending to be angry, he lightly patted the girl's buttocks and said, "Don't talk nonsense. Put the child back into Lin's arms." At this moment, the voice in the courtyard rang out again. "Grandpa, the old lady has an urgent matter to find you. Please come out quickly." The sound of urging outside the room made the little baby restless and vigorously swing his fists. "Bad guys, bad guys. You're all big bad guys trying to harm Dad." Wen Xiufu didn't even care about his own daughter, he just wanted to show off his newborn daughter to his mother later. After solemnly explaining that his 3 sons were taking good care of the Lin family, he turned around and was about to leave. "Husband, wait." Lin suddenly shouted at Wen Xiufu's figure, "Why don't you bring this child over with you?" Lin has been married to the Wen family for nearly 20 years, and although her husband has been treating her well, she has given birth to 3 sons, which is quite impressive. "I always feel that my mother-in-law's gaze at my whole family is strange, and she is not enthusiastic about her husband or her uncle. and deliver all the things I need from my own home to my uncle's family. Over the years, their husband and wife have worked together and earned a lot of money outside, but they have also been constantly helping their uncle pay off his debts. Once she doesn't help pay off her debt, the old lady will definitely start a scene and curse in her husband's ear. My husband is stingy and usually doesn't even want to take a bite of meat. Only in this matter, my husband was foolish and filial, and was forced by the old lady to spend more and more money. If this continues, the entire family business will be ruined by this ignorant little uncle. She not only has 3 sons now, but also a newborn daughter, and she doesn't want to endure like this anymore. Girl, will your father take you out for a walk? Lin asked the child in her arms gently. All right. All right. Now not only are my hands moving, but even my feet are kicking inside the bed. Wen Xiu originally wanted to refuse Lin's strange request, but seeing his daughter's excited expression, it seemed that it was not enough not to take her out. He took the baby and said, "Then you can follow Dad to recognize people." Chapter 2. First encounter of eccentric grandmother. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Mrs. Wen lost her father in less than 30 and grew up alone with her 2 sons. Because Mr. Wen went out of the city to pick up her eldest son and was killed, Mrs. Wen has been blaming her own son for her husband's death. Even though Wen Xiu is now developed, Mrs. Wen has been taken to live in the best mansion in Yangzhou City, and her attitude towards the boss has not improved. She has always been cold and indifferent. Wen Xiu has also been in a state of self-blame for decades due to his father's death. I have long been accustomed to blaming Mrs. Wen, and every time I come to her show and hall, I try my best to make up for my guilt. Basically, he does whatever Mrs. Wen says. This time, Mrs. Wen asked him to come because of her youngest son. Mrs. Wen sat upright inside the room, talking and laughing affectionately at Wen Xiu. He personally knocked walnuts on his young son, who was in his 40s. Having been brought into the city by Wen Xiu for many years, Mrs. Wen has long been supported by her imposing demeanor, and her every move shows no trace of cursing in the village for a single bite. As soon as Wen Xiu walked in, his expression changed instantly and he said coldly, "Sit down." He didn't even bother to look at him. Wen Xiu, who had been accustomed to it for so many years, gave a cold reception to Mrs. Wen and called out, "Nyang," dryly, then looked at her newborn daughter in her arms without hesitation. She is truly my daughter, even her sleeping posture is so beautiful. A newborn baby is already lacking in energy, and as soon as they step out of Lin's yard, they are already asleep. After getting close to her youngest son, Mrs. Wen finally turned her face and looked at the child in Wen Xiu's arms. She asked coldly, "Did Lin give birth today?" "Yeah. Mom, the lady has finally given birth to a daughter for me. Look at how handsome this little doll is." Wen Xiu hugged the child and wanted to approach Mrs. Wen. Mrs. Wen sat on the soft couch, preventing Wen Xiu from approaching. She only glanced from a distance and didn't even see what the child looked like. Then she calmly replied, She looks pretty good." These words directly extinguished the joy in Wen Xiu's heart and he sat back on his chair without saying a word. Sitting opposite Mrs. Wen, Wen Xiu immediately jumped out to settle the situation, not forgetting to pinch his eccentric mother in private. He came to manage Wen Xiu and ask for money this time. If he gets angry, wouldn't he not get a penny? Winter is coming soon, and he doesn't want to be kicked out to work by his mother Yeka at home. Besides, he still owes 300 taels of gambling debt outside. Yo, is this my own niece? She looks really lucky. Wen Xiu praised loudly and repeatedly, his eyes constantly spinning. Look at this, there is not a word of sincerity in what is said. This loud voice woke up Wen Baobao directly, and he opened his eyes in dissatisfaction, pounding saliva in his mouth and spitting towards his hypocritical face. What a nuisance. The baby is very tired and insists on waking him up. Upon hearing that Wen Baobao was awakened by Wen Xiu, Wen Xiufu was so heartbroken that he quickly shook his arm and comforted him softly. Wen Shouji, who was drooling all over his face, smelled the strange smell on his face and couldn't maintain his hypocrisy. He complained in a bad tone, "Big brother, your child is really annoying. He spat all over my face. It's you who vomited. Dad, he asked you for money this time, don't be fooled by him. He owes 300 taels of silver." Outside, upon hearing the voice of Wen Baobao, Wen Xiufu tried his best to calm his face, but his heart was already surging. This little brother. According to the last time I paid off 1,000 taels of gambling debt for him, it's less than 10 days, why did I gamble again? He promised himself never to gamble again. Be your own big brother, you must teach him a good lesson this time. Wen Xiufu has made up his mind to teach Wen Shouji a lesson today. Wen Xiufu's face suddenly darkened, and a pair of deep, bottomless eyes stared solemnly at Wen Shouji. After all, he is the richest man in the city, with so many people under his command, and he already has a domineering and majestic aura. Being coldly looked at by his older brother, Wen Shouji suddenly felt a little scared in his heart. Glancing at the child being held in his arms, he thought to himself, didn't Big Brother always want a daughter? Didn't he mention his daughter and make him unhappy? Wen Shouji quickly changed his mind and said, it's fortunate to have been exposed to children's saliva. I think I must have good luck today, ha ha ha. This smile is really fake. Wen Baobao leaned in the swaddling clothes and silently roast. Wen Shouji, who had made up his mind not to take this trick, said calmly, are you here today asking me for money again? As soon as these words were spoken, Wen Shouji's smile froze on his face. Big brother, isn't winter coming soon? My younger brother doesn't have the money to buy carbon stocks and wants to borrow some from you. Oh. How much do you borrow? Wen Xiufu asked. Wen Shouji raised a finger and said, not much, 1,000 taels. 1,000 taels. Wen Xiufu was shocked by Wen Shouji's request for the amount and stood up on the table. Do you know that 1,000 taels is money that a grain shop can't earn even after 10 years of work? Wen Xiufu exclaimed excitedly. And this excitement aroused Mrs. Wen's annoyance, as she grabbed the teacup in her hand and threw it directly at Wen Xiufu's head. Fortunately, Wen Xiufu reacted quickly and dodged with his body tilted, otherwise his head would have blossomed. This scene also frightened the warm baby in his arms. What a cruel heart. Dad has been taking care of his grandmother for so many years, yet he has dealt such a harsh blow to his biological son. It's really outrageous. Upon hearing that his daughter was defending him against injustice, Wen Xiufu's heart was sore and his face became increasingly ugly. After smashing a teacup at Wen Xiufu, Mrs. Wen couldn't help but curse, you have so much money. Give your younger brother 1,000 taels, what's wrong? Your younger brother has been delicate and weak since he was young, unable to endure hardship, unlike your lowly life. Give the money to your younger brother, you can earn another 1,000 taels. Upon hearing Mrs. Wen's biased words, Baby Wen pouted directly. A little baby with a puff of powder, making this expression is particularly interesting. It's really biased to go home, biased to his mother to open the door for him, biased to home. Pup, Wen Baobao's inner roast, almost made Wen Xiufu laugh. Wen Xiufu steadied his expression and said helplessly, Mother, if you're just buying charcoal for the winter, you won't need 1,000 taels. I'm worried, he's gambling again. Upon hearing Wen Xiufu's words, Mrs. Wen pretended to be angry and asked Wen Shouji, tell me, did you go gambling again? Mom, how could it be? Last time I even swore not to gamble. I think it's because my older brother didn't want to give me money and wanted to freeze our whole family alive. Your little granddaughter, who was born less than a month ago, has a really tough life. I want more money to help the children's health. Wen Shouji cried in tears. As soon as she said this, Mrs. Wen's face immediately changed. The children of the second family were the flesh on her heart. Angry, he picked up his cane and pointed it at Wen Shouji, saying, you have no good intentions. You just want to starve my grandchildren to death. Being scolded by his own mother, Wen Xiufu's heart was so sour that it was about to bubble. He lowered his head in great injustice and endured being scolded. Suddenly, a hurried footsteps ran in from outside, and it was the butler inside the mansion. Master and Madam, a group of people from the casino have arrived outside, holding big knives and shouting at the door for the second master to repay the money, otherwise they will rush in and use things to pay off their debts. Chapter 3. Grandmother Beats Dad. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. The butler anxiously asked Wen Xiufu, Master, what should we do now? Upon hearing the butler's words, Mrs. Wen anxiously asked, could they have found the wrong person? My son is so well behaved, how could he possibly owe gambling debts? The butler replied, I won't admit it wrong. They are holding IOUs with the signature of second master on them. The young one recognizes that it is second master's handwriting. Upon hearing these words, Mrs. Wen immediately felt dizzy and pulled Wen Xiuji behind her, looking protective. Turning to Wen Xiufu, he ordered, what are you still doing here? Why don't you take the money to pay off the debt quickly? Do you want to watch your younger brother being captured by these vicious people? You're already so rich, why don't you take out 1,000 taels to help your younger brother? Mrs. Wen heard the noise getting closer outside and grabbed Wen Xiuji's collar, forcing her to say. Mrs. Wen's biased words made baby Wen so angry that she kept waving her little hands. It's really excessive. One by one, they will bully my dad. It was Uncle Air who caused the trouble, why did he ask my dad to repay the money? Wen Xiufu originally had doubts about his daughter's feelings, but he didn't expect all of them to come true. He thought of his wife and 3 sons who had just given birth, and was worried that those people would harm his family. He gritted his teeth and said, I still can't do it. Immediately instructed the butler, go to the accounting room and retrieve 1,000 taels of silver, and repay the account. Upon hearing that Wen Xiuji was finally willing to help him repay his debt, he smiled and said with a relaxed voice, Big brother, please ask the butler to hand over the silver to me, and I will personally repay it. The group of casino thugs who had already broken into the yard saw the figure of Wen Xiuji appear, and without hesitation, kicked him to the ground. Mrs. Wen was so heartbroken that she quickly knelt on the ground and stood in front of Wen Xiuji. She pointed to Wen Xiufu standing beside her and said, if you want to hit him, hit him. Don't hit my precious son. No way, don't hit my dad. If you want to hit him, you owe the damn second uncle. After so many years of differential treatment by Mrs. Wen, Wen Xiufu has become accustomed to it and feels warm in his heart because of the maintenance of his daughter. To protect our children, we cannot show weakness to these villains. So he looked at the person rushing in front of him with all his aura open. A casino thug with less than 10 people in front of him dared not even take action against Wen Xiufu. After all, they are thugs raised by a small gambling house. Wen Xiufu is the wealthiest person in the city, and it is said that he has a good relationship with the official. If he offends Wen Xiufu, there will definitely be no good fruit to eat. The leader's eyes turned and his gaze shifted, casting aside Mrs. Wen, who was maintaining herself in front of Wen Xiuji with one hand. The fall on the bluestone brick was so painful that Mrs. Wen immediately screamed out. Mrs. Lin quickly helped the old lady up. The foul-smelling feet heavily stepped on Wen Xiuji's face, causing his stomach to churn and he almost vomited. Hurry up and pay back the money. Quickly taking out 3 bills of money that were still warm in his arms and handed them to the leader, he said, Hero, I'll pay it back now. I didn't notice the leader at all, but when I saw the other silver bills, my eyes lit up. Wen Xiuji's timid and sycophantic appearance made him feel like he was about to embarrass the Wen family, and he was so angry that he turned his face away. Jiang Wen Xiufu, who was the leader, withdrew the money from his hands and checked 300 taels of silver bills without any abnormalities. He directly put it into his pocket. The foot that can be stepped on Wen Xiuji's face has not been removed. Instead, they stepped even harder. The leader smiled with a hidden knife and said, Mr. Wen, brothers, on such a cold day, the whole city is coming to find you. What do you mean by not bringing it out? Before Wen Xiu could react, he reached out and pulled his hand towards his chest, looking satisfied at the dozen silver bills in his hand, each one containing 100 taels. The leader smiled with satisfaction and said, "Thank you, Mr. Wen, for your reward." Wen Xiu flattered and smiled, "Just be happy, everyone." He reached out his finger and cautiously poked the stinky foot that was stepping on his face. "Oh, why did Master Wen run to my feet and stay there? You quickly help Master Wen up." The leader's gaze signaled to the thug standing behind him. After recovering the gambling debt, the leader left with satisfaction and money. Before leaving, he politely bowed to Wen Xiu before leaving. Before leaving, he still joked in his heart, the two gentlemen of the Wen family, one is the richest man in the city and the other is a famous lazy. The difference is really not ordinary. With such an older brother, I really enjoy it. Seeing that the thugs in the casino had finally left, Wen Xiu quickly got up from the ground. Mrs. Wen also hurriedly walked towards Wen Xiu trembling and holding her youngest son in her arms with heartache. He still glared fiercely at Wen Xiu and said, "Why didn't you get beaten for your brother just now? Xiu, this little body, can't withstand the punches and kicks of those rough people." From his father's arms, Wen Baobao watched his grandmother embrace him. He was a head taller than his father, and the flesh on his face followed the trembling second uncle of the black sheep, with his mouth curled and his heart roast silently. "With such a strong body, my grandmother even said he was thin and weak, shouldn't his eyes be difficult to use? I owe so much money and deserve to be beaten." When Xiu didn't expect his daughter to speak so harshly and protest by patting her buttocks. Such a powerful tongue, it's not easy to get married in the future. Mrs. Wen, seeing that Wen Xiu remained silent, quickly rushed over and pointed at Wen Xiu's nose, saying, "Your younger brother has already suffered so much. Why are you standing here without looking at him? Hurry up and prepare good supplements to nourish your brother's body. Just being stepped on without getting hurt, what's there to fix? If we continue to fix it, we might end up like a fat pig." When Xiu frowned when she heard her daughter's roast getting worse. She must give her daughter to her wife to educate her. As for why he didn't personally educate, it wasn't because he couldn't bear to part with this precious treasure at the tip of his heart. If it were 3 sons, let's discuss it separately. Mrs. Wen frowned as she saw Wen Xiu frowning, thinking that he couldn't spare some supplements for her younger son's health. She raised her hand and slapped him directly. This slap stunned everyone present. The pain on the face. Shocked and heartbroken, Wen Xiu widened his eyes and looked at his own mother in front of him. Wen Baobao looked at his father being beaten for nothing and was so angry that he let out an irritable little milk sound in his swaddling clothes. "How dare you hit my dad? I'm going to bite you to death." Mrs. Wen looked at baby Wen with disgust as she waved her little hands and said, "This child is as annoying as you, mother." When Xiu touched the hot spot on his face full of disbelief. As a child's grandmother, she could say such words. Mrs. Wen felt impulsive when she saw the expression on Wen Xiu's face. What if she really caught the eye of her hated eldest son and didn't give him a penny? Mrs. Wen awkwardly pulled out a smile on her face and said nonchalantly, "It was my mother's impulse just now." Immediately impatiently, he said, "Quickly take the silver and supplements to Xiu and bring them home." When Xiu, who was completely saddened by this slap, glanced at the butler. The butler instantly understood the meaning of his master and reluctantly handed the things and silver notes to Wen Xiu. In the moment he turned around, he didn't forget to glare at the unruly second master. Mrs. Wen's favoritism can't even make him an outsider looked down upon. Chapter 4. Disliked Sister-in-Law. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When Xiu, who received the money, didn't have a worried expression, his mouth curling upwards uncontrollably. He knew his mother was holding on to his big brother tightly, and his trip would definitely not be in vain. Carrying a silver bill and carrying things, he said to Mrs. Wen with satisfaction, "Thank you, son." Then he turned around and left without looking back. Mrs. Wen was grateful by Wen Xiuji, and her heart would be filled with joy all day long, with her own little son in her eyes and heart. Turning his head to look at his eldest son, his eyes were filled with annoyance and he said, "All right, don't stand here either. Hurry up and help me back to the house. Dad doesn't help, Grandma is too biased." The baby is so angry now. Wen Xiufu was deeply injured by Mrs. Wen today and kept his eyelids down. When he heard the voice of Wen Baobao, he felt a bit frustrated. He found a reason to breastfeed his child and turned around, leaving with a heavy burden. This is the first time he has violated Mrs. Wen's request. Mrs. Wen behind her immediately cursed when she saw that Wen Xiufu didn't listen to her words. What a heartless thing. You've been raised for so many years in vain. Wen Xiufu, holding Wen Baobao, heard these words and paused in his footsteps. After a moment, he continued to walk away. Wen Baobao saw that Wen Xiufu had been attracted by this strange grandmother, and she also felt uncomfortable in her heart. "Dad, don't be sad. The baby will protect you when they grow up." Feeling comforted by the baby girl in his arms, Wen Xiufu let out a boo, and affectionately kissed Wen Baobao's face, forcing a smile. "It's truly my father's little cotton jacket, it's really heartwarming." When Wen Xiufu carried Wen Baobao back to the room, the child in his arms was already starving and screaming. Seeing my mother's eyes shining. "Mother, the baby is so hungry." Wen Xiufu had been away for a long time, and Lin had already woken up from sleep. Just after finishing a bowl of ginseng soup, her husband came back with the child in his arms. As soon as she walked in, Lin heard the sound of Wen Baobao saying she was hungry. She quickly picked up the child and pulled off her clothes to breastfeed. Watching the little one in her arms eat so hard that her eyes closed, Lin's maternal instincts instantly erupted. Unlike when she gave birth to 3 sons, the girl in her arms was soft and good-looking. Lin couldn't help but lighten her movements a bit. Feeding the child, Lin sure looked up and found Wen Xiufu sitting by the bed with a calm face, silent. It turned cold outside and it quickly darkened. After lighting the candles in the room, Lin Sure immediately saw the red and swollen slap marks on Wen Xiufu's face. "What's wrong with your face?" Lin was so excited that she almost choked on Wen Baobao, who was breastfeeding in her arms. Wen Xiufu quickly comforted, "I'm fine, I just fell." This excuse made Wen Baobao feel embarrassed and turned around directly. This sedan chair fell quite wickedly, leaving a palm print on its face. Lin Sure clearly didn't believe Wen Xiufu's words. Although he gave him a pale glance, he still painfully called for Ingchun to prepare a handkerchief and ointment. Hand Wen Baobao to Ingchun's arms and personally apply the ointment to Wen Xiufu. "Did my mother hit me?" Seeing Wen Xiufu silent, Lin Sure also had a rough idea in her heart. Is it related to the group of people who just broke into the mansion? As soon as I woke up, Ingchun reported to me that there were suddenly many little servants waiting at the entrance of the courtyard. When Lin asked about this level, Wen Xiufu remained silent and angrily cursed, "Why are you like a silent gourd with a sawn mouth?" I was so angry that I couldn't swallow my saliva well and choked on myself, coughing straight. Wen Xiufu pitied his wife who had just given birth and repeatedly said, "Don't get excited, I'll tell you everything." He hugged her and lightly patted Lin's back with his other hand. After a moment, he told Lin Sure everything in a few words. Lin is also a hot-tempered woman. Less than a day after giving birth, she was so angry that she got out of bed and went to Mrs. Wen's yard to seek an explanation for her husband. They are deceiving people too much. How much silver Wen Xiuji has taken from the mansion in recent years, and you have arranged for him to be the shopkeeper in the shop. He sold the shop without telling you for a few days, paid off the casino's debt, and swore one after another not to gamble anymore. But now, relying on his mother to face him, he goes to the casino time and time again without changing his mind. Which time did he come to the mansion without taking a few hundred taels of silver? Do we really think that the money we earned through hard work was brought by the strong wind? Lin and Wen Xiufu got married at a young age, both from poor families in the same village. Lin grew up in a fierce rural environment with women since childhood, and naturally developed a hot temper. In addition, she has been traveling far and wide in business and expanding her business territory in recent years. Those who are not strong have long been swallowed up to the bone by those cunning businessmen. After a long period of practice, my verbal skills have naturally improved. How could there be a foolish and guilty husband? He could only endure this and was bullied by his sister-in-law who took advantage of him and didn't want to be good, feeling extremely helpless. When Xiufu saw that Lin Shi was trembling with anger in his arms, and he was really worried about being angry at all, after all, he had just given birth and his body was really weak. He was so nervous that he quickly spoke out to comfort him, "Madam, don't get excited. If you get angry for these silver coins, your body won't be worth it. I promise my husband that my second son will never give him another copper coin if he asks for money again." Lin Shi gave him a white glance, realizing that his husband was all good, except that he swore more times not to give money to his second son than the beard on his chin. She is foolish when she believes what Wen Xiufu said. I believe what you say. Then I turned my head and stopped paying attention to Wen Xiufu. However, Wen Xiufu took the initiative to mention, "What happened today will be predicted by our daughter in advance." Should our daughter? Halfway through the conversation, Lin interrupted, "What nonsense. Don't daydream. Our daughter was born from my belly, and even if she has some special abilities, it is a blessing bestowed by heaven." Upon hearing Lin's words, Wen Xiufu immediately recalled the heartfelt comfort from his daughter when his heart was turning sour during the day. Yes, our daughter is the most precious treasure of our family, no one can bully her. I have decided to open a store for Wen Baobao to commemorate the birth of my daughter. A children's clothing store called Wen Baobao opened grandly without the knowledge of Wen Baobao, who either eats or sleeps all day long. Walking on the street, holding a baby girl named Li who was born 3 days earlier than Wen Baobao, she was happily spending the silver that Wen Shoji had obtained from Wen Xiufu. Watching another shop open on the street, he immediately leaned in. But this storefront is really strange, it's actually called Wen Baobao. She was not the only one with such views, and someone immediately asked the shopkeeper about it. The shopkeeper smiled slightly and said, "This is a children's ready-to-wear shop specially opened by Mr. Wen to commemorate the birth of Miss Wen." Upon hearing that Wen Xiufu had set up a shop for the child born to his sister-in-law who had always been at odds with him, Li's teeth were about to bite with jealousy. Looking at her daughter in her arms, she said to herself, "Poor mother, you are also children of the Wen family. Why is the difference so big? Mom, I'll bring this shop over to you." Holding the child, turning the direction, and lifting her legs, she walked towards Wen Mansion. Chapter 5. Intentionally Causing Difficulties. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Because the body of this baby now contains the soul of an adult practitioner, the newborn baby's mental state is not inferior to that of a young child. After eating and sleeping, he lay in Lin's arms with full energy every day, looking up at his mother and calling out in a milky voice. "Mother, you are beautiful." Mother's skin is white, her eyes are big, she is such a beautiful woman. "Mother, the baby needs to be kissed." After hearing this, Lin generously gave a motherly kiss to Wen Baobao with a boom sound, and the corners of her mouth were so happy that she didn't let go. Mother's beloved, mother really doesn't seem rare enough no matter how much she looks at it. The mother and daughter were enjoying a wonderful time in the room when suddenly they hurried into the room to welcome spring. Chun was personally selected by the Lin family in the hands of their grandmother after they had abundant resources. Every move is carefully trained by oneself, and there are rarely such abrupt actions. Lin held the child and looked at the expression on Chun's face, knowing that there was something troublesome. "What happened?" Lin asked with open mouth. Ying Chun nervously said, "Madam, the second master's wife has come to the mansion. The reason why she is nervous is that every time Li comes to the mansion, she will definitely argue with her own wife. Now, just a few days after my wife gave birth to the child, both the master and young master are not in the mansion. If there is really a quarrel, my wife will definitely suffer." As soon as Lin heard that her sister-in-law who couldn't help but get up early had arrived, there was a hint of sneer on her lips. "What is she doing here?" Ying Chun shook her head and said, "I don't know." As soon as she entered the mansion with her child in her arms, she went straight to the old lady's yard. Lin raised her eyebrows slightly and said, "Hold the child." Ying Chun replied, "Madam, you forgot. The second master's wife gave birth 3 days earlier than you, and she is also a daughter. The master specially sent someone to deliver a gold collar." Upon being reminded by Ying Chun, Lin finally remembered that just as the second family had finished giving birth, Wen Shouji couldn't wait to come to the mansion to report that he had to walk a lot of things from the old lady. Li Shi is even more greedy and never spits out his bones. He may not have a good heart to hold the child when he comes to the mansion this time. But now, both the bookkeeper in the accounting room and the key to the treasury are under their own control. The old lady privately subsidizes her, she can't manage it herself, but she can't afford to spend half a tael of silver in the mansion. As soon as the message was delivered from the Ying Chun room, someone from the Showan Hall came over to invite the Lin family. Ying Chun looked at Lin's weak face and said, "Madam, let's find an excuse to send someone away. We'll talk about it when the master comes back." "Don't worry, madam, even if I can't do anything, it's still easy to deal with a Li family," said Lin, aware of the thoughts of the spring protector upon hearing his mother and Ying Chun talking about the Li family. Wen Baobao quickly recalled the contents of the notebook in his mind. With pursed lips and a watery voice, he spoke a lot. Ying Chun listened with a confused expression and said, "Madam, why did Miss suddenly get excited?" If Ying Chun doesn't understand, it doesn't mean that Li Shi doesn't understand. The more she listens, the tighter her eyebrows furrow, and the anger on her face can't help but take a knife and strike at Li Shi. "Mother, Li is jealous of our family's wealth. I have received better treatment than her daughter. She wants to drown me and adopt her daughter for you. Mother, you have always wanted to steal our money, you must be careful." When I heard that my daughter, who was born in October, was constantly being cared for and killed by others, my whole heart instantly shrank into a ball of anger. The strength of holding the warm baby in both arms couldn't help but increase a bit. With a cautious expression on her face, she said, "Don't worry, my daughter. I don't think I will let you suffer any harm. Madam, are you ready? The old lady and the second lady are both waiting for you." The person in the courtyard finally couldn't stand and began to urge loudly. Wen Baobao was worried that his mother would be bullied, so he called out in a milky voice and wanted to follow along. There is a strong sense of, if you don't take me, I'll just cry and show you. I completely didn't realize that I was still at the age of drinking milk and couldn't do anything. The fleshy little hand grabbed the clothes on Lin's chest and didn't let go. Lin couldn't bear to hurt her and finally softened, saying, okay, I'll take you with me." Upon hearing Lin's words, a happy smile bloomed on her face. Lin looked helpless and said, "You clever little thing. Now it's cold, because the Lin family is still in confinement." Ying Chun specially took out the mink skin cloak placed in the box and draped it behind the Lin family. This mink coat feels smooth to the touch, with dense fur that shimmers in the sunlight, making it highly valuable at first glance. It was Wen Shoufu who deliberately searched outside during the Lin family's birthday. As soon as Lin left, Aunt Lin from Showan Hall was immediately caught in the sight of her mink coat. "Be good, this is really beautiful. It must be very valuable. This cloak is enough for her grandson to marry his wife." Lin Shi narrowed Lin Auntie's greed in her eyes and said coldly, "You said you're in a hurry, don't you leave now." With the help of another maid, Ying Xia, she lifted her steps and left. Mrs. Lin looked up at Mrs. Wen and felt quite proud in the mansion. Even the butler will give himself some face. Only in the grandfather's yard, he frequently suffered from cold treatment, and his heart had long harbored resentment. Pooh, what kind of thing are you? I'll go to the old lady's place soon, and you'll have a good time. Lin's words that offended the Lin family were heard by Ying Chun, who was preparing to change into new tea outside the house. The unfriendly tone immediately caused Ying Chun's nervousness. He put down his things and quickly entrusted the familiar servant to call the old master back. When Lin had just arrived at Xiu-Wen Hall, the woman guarding outside the door quickly ran into the room to report. Mrs. Wen kept her eyes fixed on the daughter born to her youngest son, without even blinking her eyelids, and said, "Let her wait outside first." Li was very proud of the old lady's attitude towards Lin and deliberately showed her kindness. "Mother, sister.in-law has just given birth, isn't this good?" Mrs. Wen poked Li's forehead with a compassionate expression and said, "You're just too kind in your heart. She married into the mansion and never greeted me before. What happened when I asked her to stand for a while? It happened to give her a long memory." Mother is right. Li's heart became even happier as she heard the old lady's answer. After the old lady responded with a "here," she immediately said to the Lin family in the yard, "The old lady is sleeping. Madam, please wait for a while." Just now, someone was sent to urge Lin to come over, saying that she and Li were waiting for her. Now it's said to be sleeping. This terrible excuse, even when Baobao could hear it perfunctory, was deliberately teasing his mother. Grandmother is bad. Grandmother bullying her mother is not a good person. Li looked at baby Wen in a huff and was extremely cute. "Don't worry, your mother won't be bullied." He pointed his finger at the baby's small nose in his arms looking up at the slightly open window. He said, "Since my mother hasn't woken up yet, my daughter.in-law will leave first. My daughter.in-law has just given birth, but she can't withstand the cold." He turned around and was about to leave. Upon hearing the sound of Lin's departure from the yard, Li's face changed. If Lin leaves, how could he bring his newly opened shop over for his daughter? She quickly got off the soft couch and ran out anxiously, saying, "Sister-in-law, stay a step. Mom just woke up and was about to call you in." Chapter 6. Shaking Incense Burner. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Upon hearing the anxious voice of Li behind her, Lin snorted coldly and turned back with her maid. Seeing Lin immediately stepping out of the yard and back, Li finally breathed a sigh of relief and welcomed Lin in with a smile on her face. As soon as she entered the room, Lin greeted Mrs. Wen with her child in her arms. Before Mrs. Wen could even speak, she picked up the child and found a chair to sit down on, directly offending Mrs. Wen. Accompanied by the maidservant, they received a perfect eye knife. Lin didn't take it to heart at all, but instead sneered at the old lady's ostentatious behavior. She originally came from a poor family and was raised by wealth for several years. However, she learned from the small family-style things in the deep courtyard of other households to hone her skills. Even if she achieved success, it would be considered a compliment to her. Lin knew that her evaluation of the old lady was not very good, and she had never told Wen Xiufu about it. When the couple were separated, they actually gained the old lady's favor. Therefore, every time I am here at Xiu-Wen Hall, I silently roast in my heart. She teased the girl in her arms without thinking about herself. Although Li didn't like Lin either, she took the initiative to mention Wen Baobao in order to get to the shop. "Yo, is this my newborn niece? She looks really handsome." Li habitually sat opposite Mrs. Wen, deliberately exaggerating. Mrs. Wen rolled her eyes in disdain and said, "What looks good? Where is our Yen? She's both beautiful and obedient." As she spoke, she picked up the child placed on the soft couch and teased her. Like Li's mother-daughter appearance, teasing the child she was holding together. Lin watched coldly, and the phrase, "love my house and love my dog," was vividly reflected in the old lady. Suddenly, a milky voice rang out in Lin's mind. "Humph, the name Jiayan doesn't sound like a baby's name. I don't know if my mother knows, but Li's intention was to kill me for this child. There was still a hint of concern in the tone. Hearing the fear in her daughter's heart, Lin tightly hugged the child in her arms and offered comfort. I didn't forget to glance up at the girl doll that Mrs. Wen was holding. It's not that she despises being an uncle's mother. This child has a yellow and skinny face, with big and small eyes. Anyone can tell that their daughter is much more beautiful than this child. This grandmother is indeed very biased, she can even speak such nonsense. Li's own child was praised by Mrs. Wen, and she didn't forget to take a look at the child in Lin's arms. At first glance, jealousy swelled and almost erupted on the spot. Just that pink little face cannot match my own daughter. Wearing a small golden lock around the neck, coupled with a luxurious silk dress, it looks even more like a lucky doll. Damn it, why did Lin have so many good things when she gave birth to a child, while her own child had nothing? All of this should belong to my child, and I want to take everything from that child. Li's eyes quickly flashed with hatred. And when Baobao in Lin's arms saw Li turn his head and see the hazelnut-sized matchmaker mole on his chin, with a few hairs still growing on it. His watery big eyes curved and he laughed out loud. Actually, she didn't want to laugh out loud, but now she's a baby and can't control her expression. Mao Mao has grown. Lin followed Wen Baobao's gaze and immediately understood the reason why the child laughed. Immediately, with a stern face, he whispered, "Don't mock other people's shortcomings." Wen Baobao, who was criticized by her mother for the first time, curled up her mouth in injustice. This pitiful little appearance is even more likable. But Wen Baobao's milky laughter caused dissatisfaction from Mrs. Wen. With a stern face, she said, "What's the point of laughing? I don't have the appearance of a lady from a wealthy family at all." However, Wen Jiayan in her arms was amused and giggled happily. Wen Baobao, who was criticized for no reason, still carries anger in her grievances. Eccentricity. Babies don't like grandmothers, grandmothers hate them. Wen Baobao clenched his little fist in dissatisfaction and waved his little hand. Lin couldn't bear to feel wronged and immediately retaliated for Wen Baobao, saying, "My mother scolded me right. As a girl, there should be rules. But now that Baobao is still a baby who can't even speak, why talk about rules? Jiayan was born a few days earlier than the baby. When I was talking to my mother, the child was still shouting loudly. Why don't my mother teach Jiayan the rules first and give the baby a sample?" When Lin choked, Mrs. Wen blushed and didn't say a word for a long time. I hate this eloquent daughter.in.law even more. When Lin talked about Wen Jiayan, Li felt uncomfortable. Although she had a smile on her face, she also blamed Mrs. Wen in her heart. I don't have the time to talk about it, and I dare to find faults with the Lin family, even bringing Jiayan with me. It's really annoying. Leaving aside his face, he pretended to look at the painting hanging on the wall and gave the old lady a blank glance. Li turned her head again, pretending with a smile to casually mention the matter of Wen Shoufu opening a store for her daughter. I heard that the older brother opened a shop for Wen Baobao to commemorate her birth. This child is really lucky. Unlike Jia Yan, who has nothing at birth, no one hurts or loves her. If she had a shop to commemorate her birth, how happy it would be. Upon hearing these words, Mrs. Wen hugged the child in her arms and said with a heart-wrenching expression, "What a pitiful granddaughter of my grandmother." Immediately turning his head, he said in a commanding tone to Lin, "Tell the boss to keep the shop under Jia Yan's name." This unreasonable and biased style directly made Lin laugh in anger. "Mom, tell me why." Mrs. Wen replied angrily, "Just because Jiayan is my most cherished granddaughter." "Why? You don't want to?" "Yes, I just don't want to," Lin said straightforwardly, not with a gentle and filial nature. "That's because my husband used his own strength to open a shop for her child. Since Jiayan also wants it, let her second son open a shop for her." Mrs. Wen glared angrily at Mr. Lin and said, "You know that Shoji doesn't have this ability. You're just insulting him by saying this. Lin refused to be outdone and said, without this ability, don't worry about other people's things. She glanced at Li with a sideways glance and said, be careful not to be struck by lightning. This remark angered Mrs. Wen, who picked up the things placed on the soft couch table and threw them at the Lin family. The moment that thing fell to the ground, sparks splashed everywhere, causing several holes in Lin's dress to burn. Lin was so surprised that she quickly stood up holding the child in her arms and took a few steps back. Upon closer inspection, Mrs. Wen threw the incense burner on the table at her. If it weren't for the lack of an open flame in this incense burner, I'm afraid my whole body would have been engulfed by flames. Such a mother.in.law clearly wants her own life. Moreover, she was still holding the child in her arms, so she didn't worry at all about the child being burned. It is extremely malicious to stand out for my youngest son to this extent. Lin's face suddenly darkened and she said, Mom, are you intentionally killing someone for my life? Chapter 7. Private Money. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Watching Lin's face turn cold, Mrs. Wen suddenly felt a little scared in her heart. Lin continued to force her to ask, Mother, don't you not know that killing requires paying for your life? Startled by Lin, Mrs. Wen's face instantly changed, pointing at her and moving her lips, unable to speak. Upon seeing the situation was not good, Li was afraid that Mrs. Wen might implicate her. Lin, who had always kept her promise, grabbed her into the government office and quickly threw her into the old lady's arms. She spoke pitifully, and did not forget to soothe Mrs. Wen's rapid breathing. Mom, don't worry, my sister.in.law is always speaking angrily. Ge doesn't want that shop anymore, it's for your health. Lin's sharp gaze turned to Li's and he said, what my younger sibling said was that it was my mother who threw the incense burner on me, but it turned out to be my fault. Besides, that shop doesn't belong to your family at all, and I didn't promise to give it to your child. Why are you pointing fingers at the shop? Holding Wen Baobao who was almost injured, Lin's mouth was full of fire, and she couldn't say a single word that she was scolding her mother.in.law and daughter.in.law. Wen Baobao, who witnessed all of this, was so excited that even his little feet in swaddling clothes moved excitedly. My mother is mighty, she is the best, mother, the baby raises a big flag for you. Lin glanced at Mrs. Wen, who was pretending to be dizzy, and there was no point in staying any longer. She just left with her maid. Before leaving, he deliberately said, the shop belongs to my daughter. Whoever dares to think about it, let's meet at the yamen. As soon as Lin stepped out of the room, she heard Mrs. Wen's crying from behind. Why did Wen Shoufu find such a ruthless woman? When Mrs. Wen cried, her nose and tears flowed down her face, basically, it all dripped onto Li's sleeve, who was trying to calm her down. Li almost pushed Mrs. Wen to the ground when she saw the stains on her sleeves. This is a cloud brocade that is hard to come by. The old lady actually ruined such precious clothes for me. At this moment, Li had no intention of coaxing the old lady and just wanted to leave quickly. Mom, I suddenly remembered that there was something else at home, so I went back first. Before the old lady could react, Li immediately hugged Wen Jiayan and left. Mrs. Wen noticed that Li was in a hurry and forgot about not being able to get angry. She kindly opened her mouth and asked, do you need silver? Li's eyes rolled as she thought, there's still silver left at home, not much should be enough. However, after spending this time, the family won't have any extra money to buy grain. She used her usual trick of asking for money. Upon hearing Li's words, Mrs. Wen immediately thought of her beloved youngest son and those two grandsons. Turning around, she repeatedly urged Aunt Lin to quickly bring over the small redwood box containing her personal belongings, with a lock hanging on it. Drive out everyone in the room except for Li. With my ears pressed against the door, I heard the footsteps of these servants walking away before sitting back on the soft couch. Li became somewhat impatient with this series of actions and forced a smile on her face, asking, Mom, what are you doing? Mrs. Wen raised her palm as a signal for her to remain silent. With the other hand touching the bun adorned with pearl hairpins, he pulled out a strand from it. This plucked pearl hairpin may seem no different from other pearl hairpins, but the end inserted into the hair is uneven. Mrs. Wen held a pearl hairpin and inserted it directly into the keyhole. With a slight twist of the wrist and a click, the lock hanging on the small red box was opened. Mrs. Wen smiled with satisfaction and then inserted the pearl hairpin into her bun, which was set off by the emerald green all over her head. She couldn't even notice the abnormality of this one. Immediately, under Li's surprised gaze, Mrs. Wen lifted the lid. Inside was a box full of large silver bills, as well as a few heavy gold ingots. "Mother, why do you have so much money?" She really looked at Li's shirt dumbfounded. "It's all from those unfilial sons over the years." Mrs. Wen drew 7 or 8 silver bills from inside and stuffed them into Li's hand, saying, "Take them and use them quickly. Don't trouble my son and grandchildren." "Thank you, mother." Li was ecstatic in her heart, but on her face, she silently carried the money into her arms. After leaving Xiu-Wen Hall, he walked out of the mansion with a smile all the way. "Although I didn't ask Jiayan to go to the shop, it's worth a few hundred taels," Li thought happily as she hugged her child. Li had just left with his front foot, and when Shofu rode his horse back to the mansion with his back foot. "As soon as I entered the mansion, I was taken to Xiu-Wen Hall by a maid sent by Mrs. Wen to guard the entrance in advance. As soon as she entered the room, Mrs. Wen threw a teacup directly in front of Wen Shofu and angrily cursed, 'Kneel down.' Mrs. Wen doesn't give any face to Wen Shofu. In front of everyone in the room, she made Wen Shofu kneel down. Wen Shofu glanced at the people serving in the room, and those with vision immediately stepped down. Seeing that there was no one in the room, Wen Shofu obediently knelt down on the ground, completely devoid of the wise decisions made in the business just now. "Mom, what happened again? It made you so angry. Boss, you really married a great wife." Mrs. Wen became more and more angry as she spoke. She simply got off the soft couch and stood in front of Wen Shofu, teaching him a lesson like she did when she was young. While speaking, he poked Wen Shofu's head with his fingers. "The second family just wants a shop, isn't there anything they can't give? You have so many shops under your name, so what's wrong with giving her one? It must be the money-losing item specially made for her, as a commemorative item. I, as a mother.in.law, said I to her and even sent me to the government. It's really outrageous." When Shofu lowered his head and listened to Mrs. Wen's complaint, roughly guessing the truth behind the matter. I didn't believe Mrs. Wen's words. Upon hearing his own mother scold him for holding the daughter in his palm as a loser, Wen Shofu suddenly felt uneasy. "Mom, that shop really can't be given to my second brother. It was a shop I specially opened for my daughter. What's giving it to my second brother?" Upon hearing this, Mrs. Wen realized that Wen Shofu was unwilling to give the shop to the second wife. With a quick thought, she said, "That shop is fine, but you have to give the second wife another shop." Upon hearing these words, Wen Shofu was instantly annoyed and declined, "I need to discuss this matter with my wife. Let's talk nonsense about it. You're a loser, I can't even handle this small matter. It's really a waste of money raising you." Mrs. Wen cursed. When Shofu said, "Madam, after all these years of working hard with me to save up these assets, we should have half of her." Mrs. Wen impatiently waved her hand and said, "It's worth it. I don't want to listen to these things. If you want to discuss with her, go quickly. The second family is running out of money, so you'd better act quickly." When Shofu suppressed his anger and said, "I know." He then left Xiu-Wen Hall. As soon as I returned to my small courtyard, I pushed open the door and saw Lin holding her child while breastfeeding. The warm scene in front of him has been his top priority for so many years. I found a stool to sit down and gently looked at my wife and daughter. Chapter 8. New Students. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After finishing his meal, Wen Baobao tilted his head and saw Wen Shoufu's kind father looking at him. He opened his small mouth and called out to Wen Shoufu with a milky voice. His fleshy little hands even tried to reach out. This painful appearance has melted Wen Shoufu's heart. As soon as I thought of my own mother saying that my daughter was a loser, my heart suddenly became sour. I raised my hand and took Wen Baobao into my arms, using some strength to hold her tightly. Reluctantly muttering in a low voice, "My daughter is not a loser, she is the little treasure that I keep warm and frugal in my heart. A married man is like a wife." From Wen Shoufu entering the house, Lin Shi saw that his face was not good. After tidying up his clothes, he asked, "Where did you go to your mother?" "She told you about me again, right?" Wen Shoufu nodded and said, "It's not your fault for this. I also refused my mother's offer to give the shop to the second son." Upon hearing these words, Lin's dissatisfaction finally dissipated. But on his face, he still looked cold and said, "Tell me, what demands does my mother have from you again?" Wen Shoufu said, "My mother said that the shop she opened for the child can be given to the second child, but it must be given to him as a temporary shop." Dream. Lin said in a tone that was not good. "You ask your mother, do you want to find a temple to offer the second son and his family, so that they can eat and drink freely, and also be worshipped by others?" "Oh, what are you talking about?" Wen Shoufu sighed with a worried expression. He prefers to stay in the shop rather than going back to his hometown. At least not these annoying things. Lin warned, "If you dare to go to the second shop behind my back, I will take the child with you and leave." Seeing that Lin was really angry, Wen Shoufu quickly placed Wen Baobao in the cradle. Sitting beside Lin, coaxing his wife. He has seen Lin's dedication to the business of the government over the years. He couldn't bear to part with his own child's mother. Early in the dark, after dinner, Wen Shoufu personally comforted Wen Baobao to sleep. Unexpectedly, as soon as the child was placed in the cradle, Wen Jinjin rushed in quickly. "Dad, I want to see my sister." Wen Shoufu felt a headache as he watched his waist-high son chatter, afraid that his newly fallen daughter would be awakened. Sure enough, the sleeping baby Wen opened his eyes. Watching Wen Progressive lying beside the cradle, Wen Baobao suddenly let out a deep sigh in her heart. Poor third brother, the two sons of the second uncle's family, were bullied by them every day after going to school. He was also falsely accused of stealing money, insulting the master, and his reputation was ruined. Finally, I couldn't help but choose to jump into the river. Now if I can take another look at Sangu, let's take another look. The voice of Wen Baobao's heart instantly echoed in the minds of the three people connected by blood in the room. Wen Jinjin's face turned pale with fear. A few days ago, he was happy to learn that the children of his second uncle's family were attending the same school as him. Wen Shoufu and Lin's faces were also very ugly. Especially Lin, holding her youngest son tightly in her arms, whispered, "My son is not afraid, my mother is here." Looking up at Wen Shoufu, he said, "If the children of the second family dare to bully in progress, I will repay them 10 times. Wen Shoufu dared not refute Lin's words, because every time Wen Baobao said something was true. The next day, Wen Shoufu was worried about his youngest son and personally escorted him to the school. He also assigned 2 young attendants to be at the school gate, responsible for picking up and dropping off Wen Jinjin. Because these 2 little boys are sitting at the door, Wen Jinjin is particularly imposing in front of the students in the school. But Wen Jinjin didn't pay any attention to these things, but sat on the stool with a bitter face, lowered his head and remained motionless. Li Xiaotong, the legitimate son of the prefect's family, sat on the empty seat in front of Wen Jinjin curiously and asked, "Why are you bringing 2 servants over today, kid?" Ge Wen always kept his head down and remained silent. Li Xiaotong originally wanted to ask him what was wrong, but as the master walked in, he immediately returned to his position. As soon as the master walked in, a new face followed behind him. As soon as this new face saw Wen Progressive, it excitedly shouted, "Progressive cousin." Wen Jinbao was taken aback by the shout, his face devoid of joy, and he looked particularly unattractive. The master originally thought that the new child's surname Wen was just a coincidence, but he didn't expect that they were actually cousins with Wen Jinbao. Arranged the two people to sit together immediately. No way. Wen Jinbao suddenly stood up and shouted. This shout made the room instantly quiet. When progressive, what's wrong with you? The master asked in surprise. This master surnamed Feng, although strict in his studies, is a kind old man in other things. Wen Jinbao saw his classmate casting a strange look at him, and instantly realized his composure. He quickly found a suitable reason. Master, although the student has a relative relationship with this new classmate, it's really not appropriate to sit together. The two of us will delay each other's studies due to reminiscing about the past. Feng Fuzi didn't expect Wen Jinbao, who has always been mischievous in class, to be able to speak such progressive words. Since he has a drive for self-improvement, as a teacher, he should achieve success and not cut off the student's path to learning. Feng Fuzi looked up and finally placed the newly arrived Wen family member next to Li Xiaotong. Then he picked up the ruler and knocked on the table, starting his lecture. An hour later, the bell rang. Feng Fuzi put down the book in his hand, gave a few instructions, and then turned around and left. The originally quiet classroom exploded in an instant. Everyone is interested in this new student. Immediately surrounded the people. But Li Xiaotong showed impatience on his face and said, "Let's all make way, it's delaying my young master's departure." In Yangzhou City, Li Xiaotong can at least be considered a son of an official family. As the saying goes, the people do not fight against officials. Most children in the same classroom are from wealthy families, so it is understandable to seek good luck and avoid bad luck. Faced with Li Xiaotong's bad expression, no one dared to resist. Quietly make way. As soon as Li Xiaotong stepped out of the crowd, this group of people immediately surrounded him. Chattering incessantly. Li Xiaotong turned his head and sneered, sitting directly next to Wen Jinbao. Although he and Wen Jinbao don't usually look up to each other, the new one surnamed Wen is even more disliked. "Hey, are you so strange today? Is it because of him?" Li Xiaotong nuzzled his lips and asked. Wen Jinbao turned his head and looked at his cousin, who was only a few days younger than him, surrounded by the crowd. His face turned ugly and he said, "Yes." This answer left Li Xiaotong stunned for a moment, and he chuckled directly with a pop sound. "What's so scary about that bean sprout?" Li Xiaotong looked like a big brother and patted Wen Jinbao's shoulder with great loyalty. He couldn't be considered comforting and said, "Don't worry, that bean sprout vegetable dares to bully you. Big brother will stand up for you. I'll have my father send a constable to catch him." Wen Jinbao forced his lips to crack open and said, "Thank you." Li Xiaotong, who claimed to have brought Wen Jinbao under his command, immediately took responsibility and listened attentively to what the new newcomer was saying to everyone. Chapter 9. Being ridiculed. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Although Wen Shouji achieved nothing and relied on getting money from Wen Shoufu to make a living, he still had high expectations for his two sons. "I hope they can go to high school soon and dominate the wealthy." Spending a lot of money to hire someone to give to Wen Jin's eldest son, who is only a few days behind in the financial year, and his second son, who is 1 day younger than Wen Jin, respectively, named Wen Gaoxue and Wen Zhongju. The second son has been influenced by Wen Shouji since childhood. He did not learn the good things, but instead, he basically spread the bad habits of the couple. Especially the second son Wen Zhongju, who enjoys being pursued the most. As soon as I saw that I had just arrived at the new private school on my first day, surrounded by so many people, I was extremely happy and couldn't even suppress the pressure on my lips. "Wen Zhongju, is your father also in business like Wen Jinbao's father?" A chubby little man in the room struggled to pull apart the crowd and curiously approached Wen Zhongju and asked. This chubby little man's name is Meng Shui. He looks unremarkable, and his father is also a famous businessman in Yangzhou City. His mother and Li Xiaodong's mother are legitimate sisters born from the same belly. In private schools, it is also an existence that no one dares to offend. Upon hearing Meng Shi's question, Wen Zhongju's lips stiffened as he recalled the appearance of his father who had just returned from outside this morning, full of alcohol, and remained silent for a long time. He is 8 years old this year and has long known that the house and living expenses at home are all money from his uncle. He can't tell these classmates that his father is a troublemaker who spends his days in casinos and taverns. Meng Shi looked at Han, but he was actually a lively-minded person. At a glance, he could see that Wen Zhongju's father was not doing a legitimate business. In front of all his colleagues, he mercilessly sneered and turned around to leave. Those who study in this private school are all second-generation elites from various fields. How could they not understand the meaning of Meng Shi's departure? Looking at Wen Zhongju's gaze, the meaning changed. The surrounding crowd quickly dispersed, and everyone returned to their usual carefree and playful demeanor. Wen Zhong looked around and saw the vastly different attitudes of these colleagues, their faces turning blue. The hands on the table involuntarily clenched into fists. Looking up at one progressive who was playing with Li Xiaotong, hatred was about to emerge in his eyes. Wen High School, who came to study in a private school on the same day, did not fare much better. Wen Jinkai has a high talent for studying and is a famous figure in a private school. In order to receive better guidance from renowned teachers for his eldest son, Wen Shoufu sent Wen Jinkai to study at the White Horse Academy in the capital on the third day after the Lin family gave birth. Lu Fuzi, who had taught Wen Jinkai in a private school, thought that Wen High School was of the same age and bloodline as Wen Jinkai, and they were not much different in terms of education. Therefore, he arranged for him to attend the Juzi Rush class where Wen Jinkai left the private school. In this sprint class, there are all the poor and rich students, and the only thing that interests them is reading. Wen High School, on the other hand, was only a person with mediocre academic talent. On the first day of class, Lu Fuzi asked 3 questions in a row but couldn't answer them, and even the last ones in the room were mocking him. Previously, colleagues who did not deal with Wen Jinkai even retaliated against Bengali against Wen High School. Some even joked, "You're such a fool, shouldn't it be Wen Jinsai's father who spent money to buy you a spot to study in a private school?" Ha ha ha. Instantly, they burst into laughter. Coincidentally, this statement directly exposed the truth that the 2 brothers were able to study in the private school where the wealthy children gathered. Lu Fuzi slammed hard on the table and shouted, "Don't shut up, if we continue to make trouble, we'll kick you out." Turning around, I couldn't help but shake my head repeatedly. Wen Gaoxue, who always values face, has a flushed face and neck, and his eyes are full of blood. After school, when these 2 brothers left the private school, their faces became increasingly ugly. When she returned home, Li had just finished coaxing Wen Jiayan and was admiring the new Yunjini dress she had bought with the money given by Mrs. Wen. And Wen Shouji, who had not woken up all day, sat on the side drinking in a daze, occasionally responding to Li Shi with a few words. Seeing the return of his 2 sons whom he had high hopes for, he quickly asked with a smile, "Son, how is the new private school?" Upon hearing these words, the faces of both sons were pulled down and they remained silent in agreement. Wen Shouji, who was drunk, was very indifferent and kept asking questions. The young Wen Zhongju couldn't bear to roar and said, "What's there to ask? Are you bothering me?" Wen Shouji, who was confused and scolded by his younger son, looked bewildered and then asked his eldest son again, but he didn't give a good face either. Wen Gaoxue directly criticized Wen Shouji, saying, "You only know how to drink all day long, so you can't learn from Wen Jinsai's father. You've disgraced our brothers." After scolding Wen Shouji, Li Shi, who was also puzzled, did not escape the anger of her eldest son. "Mom, you know how to spend a lot of money on these useless things. Why don't you ask a good teacher to teach us with this money?" The more he said, the more excited he became, and he threw all the things on the table to the ground. The loud noise woke up Wen Jiayan, who had just been lulled to sleep, and she cried loudly at the top of her throat. Why cry? You know to cry all day long, useless thing. Apart from being subjected to the same kind of criticism as Wen Zhongju, not a single person in the room escaped from Wen's mouth. Looking at these family members who had brought shame to himself, General Wen Gao smashed a front-facing vase that he had just received from Wen Shoufu inside the house, and angrily led his younger brother away. This incident directly woke up Wen Shouji's hangover. Looking at the messy ground and listening to the crying young girl, he blamed all the mistakes on Wen Shoufu. You are so kind and frugal that you let someone bully my son in a private school. I knew you had a bad heart when you helped to clear the relationship and let my sons go to school. Despite his old face, he kept cursing, completely forgetting that it was him who begged Wen Shoufu to let his two sons go to a private school. Li even hugged Wen Jiayan and ran to the Wen mansion in the dark to report to Mrs. Wen. The servant on duty at the gate of the Wen mansion had just opened the door when Li Shi rushed inside without saying a word, but the servant didn't stop him. Chasing behind Li, he shouted loudly, "Someone is rushing in." The shout was heard by the passing Ying Chun. As soon as Ying Chun saw it, the annoying Li family arrived at the mansion in less than a day, with a furrowed brow. After instructing the little girl next to her to inform Lin about Li's arrival at the mansion, she quickly stepped forward and stopped the person. "Hello, second madam." Ying Chun greeted Li Shi with a smile on her face. "Even if you hate the Li family no longer, you must fulfill all the formalities, otherwise if others catch your little braids, your wife will follow you and suffer injustice." Li was suddenly stopped on her way and felt very unhappy. But looking at this person in front of me, who has a familiar face, she is still the maid serving Lin Shi's side. Li stopped her steps and sneered with a gloomy expression, "Oh, isn't this the maid who is serving her sister? Law." Chapter 10. Getting Hurt in Welcoming Spring. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Upon hearing the unkindness in Li's words, Ying Chun was not afraid. After several weeks of courtesy, he remained calm and said, "Second madam, is there anything urgent about coming to the mansion? Do you need me to report to the masters?" Upon hearing Ying Chun's words, Li's face became even more ugly. The fierce woman's temperament immediately became apparent, and she cursed loudly, "What kind of thing are you? You're just a lowly servant, how dare you point fingers at me? Sure enough, I followed some kind of master and learned something." Li Shi, along with his old grievances, also beat Lin Shi in a roundabout way. "Don't go too far." Hearing Li insulting Lin, the calm expression on Ying Chun's face instantly became tense. Li looked at the maid in front of her who was shouting at her, feeling even more angry. With sharp and sarcastic triangular eyes, she raised her hand and slapped Ying Chun's face. Lin Shi, who was rushed over, happened to see this scene. "How dare you harm the people around me?" Wen Baobao was held by Ying Xia, her pink face bulging with anger, and she opened her mouth and moaned with a milky voice. Although I don't know what she was shouting, judging from her small appearance, she must have cursed extremely profusely. Wen Jiayan in Li's arms did not show weakness. Drifting his head out of Li's arms, waving his little hands, he began to fight against Wen Baobao. For a moment, the cries of two babies could be heard everywhere in the front yard, turning it into a baby battlefield. But Wen Jiayan was thin and small, and her mental state was not as strong as that of Wen Baobao. Before 2 rounds, she withdrew her head and returned to Li's arms, crying silently. If it weren't for the tight embrace of Ying Xia, even Wen Baobao would have rushed forward and played a set of baby whoosh fists. After being reborn, Wen Baobao won his first verbal altercation in this life, laughing contentedly and waving his little hands proudly. "Mother, the baby has avenged Ying Chun. Isn't the baby very powerful? You're such a troublemaker." Lin scolded, but the corners of her eyes betrayed her true emotions. Li couldn't stand others being stronger than him, especially compared to Lin. With a stern gaze, she quickly walked up to Lin and raised her hand to teach Wen Baobao a lesson. That hand was stained with Ko Dan's long nails, deliberately bent and aimed at Wen Baobao's face. Once you scrape off a baby's tender skin, it's an indelible scar. Stop it! Lin exclaimed in panic. Yingchen saw Li rushing towards the young master, quickening her steps and grabbing Yingxia's arm, which was about to hold Wen Baobao, blocking the two behind her. But he was slapped by the Li family. The fingernails of that tail finger sank in half, leaving a nearly bony opening on Yingchuan's face. Fresh red blood instantly flowed out, staining half of her fair face red. Yingchen, who received 2 consecutive slaps, had a face full of redness, swelling, and blood that was heart-wrenching. Welcoming spring. Lin Shi saw the bright red blood on her face and quickly shouted to the servants around her, "Hurry up and call the doctor over." Immediately turning around, with a tense face, he walked quickly to Li's face, exerting all his strength. He slapped Li's face fiercely with his backhand. The face that had been slapped instantly turned red and swollen with gums. There is also a buzzing sound in the ears. After a long pause, Li finally regained consciousness and widened her eyes in disbelief. "How dare you hit me?" This loud slap stunned both the injured Yingchen and the people present. Wen Baobao, who was embraced by Yingxia, didn't even blink his eyelids and looked at his mother with admiration, trying to capture the moment of Lin Shi's majesty. "My mother is so handsome. You broke into my mansion, harmed my daughter, injured my loyal servant, and were extremely arrogant. You didn't even consider me as the head of the household. Today, I will take you to the Yamen to seek justice." "How dare you?" Li suddenly panicked when she heard that Lin was going to take her to the Yamen, pretending to be calm and confronting Lin. Lin said, "The fact that you hurt someone is here, what dare I do? Someone, tie up this wicked woman firmly and take her to the Yamen." The Lin family, as the head of the household, was very dignified in the mansion, and most of the servants had to be taken care of during the spring festival. In no time, a few strong servants took 3 hemp ropes as thick as their fingers. It was easy to tie the struggling Li family tightly. Wen Jiayan also handed it over to a maid to hold. The pain of the hemp rope stuck in the flesh made Li Shi scream repeatedly, "Lin Qingru, you slut, you must die hard. I will never let you go." Immediately, she raised her neck and shouted, "Mother-in-law, save me. This slut is going to take me to the government." The sharp shout was so piercing that Lin frowned and raised her hand to the other side of her face, then vigorously fanned it. With 2 full slaps, Lin almost couldn't stand steady from exhaustion, and her drooping palms trembled slightly. But it didn't stop scolding Li. "You shut up for me." Looking at the servant standing by Li's side, he said, "What are you still doing? Take the person away quickly." Lin rubbed the painful palm of the slap and glanced at Li's mournful mouth, saying, "Block her mouth for me. Stop it. I see who dares." Mrs. Wen heard from Mrs. Lin that the Lin family was going to arrest the Li family to the government without even putting on her shoes, so she rushed over in a hurry. Afraid of being 1 step late, her beloved grandson will have no mother. Seeing Mrs. Wen anxious to save Li, Wen Baobao, who was being held by Yingxia, pouted in extreme dissatisfaction. "It's really biased, I don't even care about putting on shoes." Upon seeing Mrs. Wen appear, Li's heart immediately returned to her stomach, tears streaming down her face, and she kept sobbing. "Hurry up and let me go." Mrs. Wen stood in front of Ms. Li, confronting Ms. Lin, and her mother-in-law commanded with great fanfare. After marrying into the Wen family for so many years, the Lin family is no longer the naive young girl she used to be. At first, she would also secretly feel sad because of Mrs. Wen's favoritism. But the day after she gave birth to her eldest son, she understood a truth. This already biased heart cannot be brought back. Lin's aura did not diminish. "Mother, Li has injured my loyal servant seriously. I will never let anyone go." Seeing that Lin's heart was determined not to let go of others, Mrs. Wen angrily pointed at her and cursed, "Why did my Wen family marry you, such a cruel person? You've been unlucky for 8 lifetimes. Someone. Bring the boss back to me. I want to see if the boss is listening to you or if I'm a mother. Mrs. Lin's son, upon seeing her own mother's expression, immediately ran out of the mansion and went to the shop to find Wen Xiufu. On the way back, I didn't forget to add fuel to the story and explain it in a black and white manner. Wen Xiufu's face became increasingly ugly. As soon as he entered the mansion, he calmly ordered Lin Shi, let the people go. Upon hearing Wen Xiufu's order to release someone, Mrs. Wen snorted proudly and coldly. Do you say it again? The feeling of grievance and disappointment filled her chest, and Lin Shi looked at Wen Xiufu's indifferent face, suppressing the tears in her eyes. I said, let the person go. With a loud bang, everyone present was once again stunned.